Hochberg. I'm visiting Reed Hall from Columbia University, where I am a professor of Hebrew and Middle East Studies and Visual Studies. And I'm the chair of the Department of Middle East Studies, South Asia Studies, and African Studies. And I'm very happy to be here today to interview Roni.
My name is Roni Henig. I'm an assistant professor of modern Hebrew literature at New York University. In 2019, 2020, I had the honor of being a fellow here at the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. And it's a particular honor and pleasure to be back here with the book that I was working on when I was a fellow here.
Roni, it's such a pleasure to be here with you and talk about this book on revival, Hebrew literature between life and death. And I remember I have the honor to meet this in an object because when I arrived at Columbia, Roni was towards the very end of writing her dissertation, and I had the honor to join her committee. So I know a very early version of what has developed into this book. So maybe if you would like to start us off with telling us in most general terms about the book, about revival and its connection to Hebrew literature and life and death.
Yeah, that's a lot, but I will do my best. Well, this is a book about language, first and foremost, right? But more specifically, it's a book about the Hebrew language and what happened to Hebrew on the verge of the 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century. Something that is framed traditionally in the historiography of modern Hebrew literature, in modern Jewish history, as the revival of Hebrew, in Hebrew, Tchiyat Ha'ivrit. So the book is about the idea of language revival, but what it's not doing, I guess is helpful to say, is that the book is not engaging in telling or retelling the story of the revival of Hebrew. Instead, what it does, it is taking this metaphor and all of the sub-metaphors that are entwined with it, the metaphor of revival, the idea of revival, and breaking it apart. And asking why this metaphor of revival, which is very much tied to the question, to a standing between life and death, why this is the metaphor that is used to describe this transformation of the language, and what kind of other stories are being told when Hebrew is being transformed and when Hebrew is this object of so many heated debates about language, but also about nation, Jewish nationalism, ideology, the Jewish body. So really, it goes back to this formative moment in the life, in the history of Hebrew, of modern Hebrew. And one of the things I think that I can say now in hindsight that were so appealing for me in this moment is the indeterminacy of Hebrew at this point, right? The fact that it's not yet stable. Hebrew was not a spoken language before the 20th century. It was used in writing, it was used in religious ritual, but it wasn't used in the realm of everyday life. And these are the moments where Hebrew is becoming a spoken idiom, when it will eventually become also the language of a nation state and tied to a nationalist and a Zionist project. But early 20th century, it's this moment where Hebrew is not yet completely tied to a territory, to a nationalist project. It's in the process of being standardized, of being transformed, but there is something about this mutability of the language and the idea that the language might be able to transform, that the words could be spoken differently, that I think was appealing to me on many different levels.
Thank you. That's so fascinating. So, I think for many, the idea that Hebrew wasn't spoken and then revived is perhaps known, but maybe you can, just before we go into the more detail of the books, just say something more about this to contextualize this for our audience, because sometimes it's very confusing and people ask people in the field, what does it mean, modern Hebrew? What's its relationship to biblical Hebrew? So maybe just very few words about the actual project of revival.
Yeah, so it's like probably it's important to say that well, first of all, for the writers who were a part of this discourse that I'm exploring, right, early 20th century Hebrew writers, Hebrew was not considered a dead language, or definitely not a fully dead language. Maybe something between dead and alive, but
Mm-hmm.
definitely not a dead language, because Hebrew was used in many different contexts as a language of writing. There is a history of Hebrew literature, from biblical times through the Middle Ages, and in the 16th century and 17th century. So there's definitely Hebrew literature being written, but Hebrew was not used as a spoken idiom. Not everyone had access to Hebrew, and especially not women, not people from lower classes. And the thing that is happening in the beginning of the 20th century is not only turning Hebrew into a spoken language, but also charging it with with a nationalist meaning and with a particular nationalist project, which is Zionism, and that wasn't always the case. So early 20th century Hebrew revival is really about turning Hebrew into a language that could be used in everyday life and that could serve this nationalist project. And maybe, in the long run, also turning it into a mother tongue, because at that point it was no one's mother tongue, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who learned Hebrew in the beginning of the 20th century, the writers who were capable of writing Hebrew, usually acquired the language in a traditional Orthodox context. So they studied it in the yeshiva, in the cheder, and then in the yeshiva, as part of the Orthodox educational system, and that was reserved only to men for the most part. And then these people kind of left the religion and became more versed within the European cultures that they were living in. And for the most part, people who were Hebrew writers in the first decade of the 20th century, they were somewhere in between these two worlds, right? They began from an Orthodox point of departure and went into a more kind of enlightened um, cultural space. Um, and this is where the revival also came from, right? It is fed from European ideas.
Mm-hmm.
It is fed from Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment and romantic ideas. So this is the cultural context.
Right. Thank you. This is very important. And I want to take this opportunity to ask you, I mean, we acknowledge that it's the moment. Talking about a project like a national project like Zionism is not an easy thing to do. And I also fully understand that the book is not actually about assessing the movement in any way. But it's also an opportunity precisely because everybody uses the term and many people don't necessarily know what the term means or what it could have meant for certain people at different times. Um, could you say just something a little bit more about, well, the question is first historical, about the moment of the National Zionist appeal for the particular authors that you engage with, right? And they have very different, Echad Ha'am, Bialik, very, very different, Brenner, very different perspectives. Something about that, and then also something perhaps about what it means to have this idea and connection, this strong idea and connection between language, ideology, and nationalism, but in the context of early 20th century, right? So not reflecting on it uh, backwards, not from the moment where we know where things went,
Yeah.
right? But from the moment that you're trying to let us actually go into the minds of these people and these writers. In maybe what I'm trying to even push further is the book allows us to see that it's not that when you read Bialik or Echad Ha'am or Katzenelson or Brenner, you are reading some massive program of, becoming a militant national
Yeah.
state, right? So what is in their mind? What's happening there?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think first of all, it helps me realize that really the book is about a relationship to language and an experience of language, right? So this is what is interesting to me, how they experience the language, what exactly is their relationship to the language. And I think the thing that maybe was surprising or that kind of made me want to explore this further is there's counterintuitiveness to that, right? It's not, oh, this is the Hebrew language, it's a national language, now we shall become Zionist and establish the Israeli state. It's much more complicated than that. There is something, so, and it also depends on the position that they come from. So for the man writers, there is something about Hebrew that is this kind of elite object that they are the only ones that have full access to, and they can play with it. It's a language, it's an idiom in the making, right? It's a language that lacks vocabulary, that lacks modern vocabulary, that has all of these heavy religious ties and historical layers, and being able to master, quote unquote, because that's exactly the notion that I'm questioning. The language gives them something really, really interesting, and it also allows them to invent some modernist poetic forms in Hebrew. But it also allows for this transformation, and this whole moment, for them is a moment of transformation, and there's a wish here to become different, right? To become different subjects, to become national subjects as part of a nationalist project. And by the way, I should also say that Jewish nationalism and Zionism is not exactly the same thing. There are overlaps, but there is also Jewish nationalism that is not Zionism. But that's, I guess, a side note. But yeah, there is something in the language that is at once very appealing to them, also frustrating to them. There's this recurring attempt to master, to standardize, to conquer the language. So there's definitely violence in the rhetoric and violence in the discourse. But I would say it's not only that, and there's also some escapability, to the language that they are constantly are faced with, and I think are also kind of attracted to. So Bialik would write about Chaim Nachman Bialik, who is considered to be the national Hebrew poet to this day. He would write about Hebrew as a language that needs to be mastered, that we need to control, that we need to discover her, entire body and spread its organs, and it's really visceral metaphors. But then it also escapes. There is something about it that is fundamentally uncontrollable. So I would say this is pretty much the experience that is reoccurring in different forms across the different texts that I'm reading, that something about Hebrew is there to make us different, and so we need to conquer the language, but also it escapes us, and that is also something that is appealing, if that makes sense.
Right, right. So that's true. I mean, I think when I read the book, I thought that one of the interesting things that come across the different writers is indeed this experience that is almost mystical, right? Because it's on the one hand, your job as a writer is to master this woman language, and in Hebrew, language is feminine. But she keeps escaping, right? It's almost like Hebrew language is a femme fatale.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there is something about that, especially the dead part.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Very interesting. So maybe from this we can talk a little bit about another aspect of this that comes very clearly in the book, which has to do with, again, the idea of Hebrew revival, the language revival as an essence of bringing up or healing a people, which kind of at the same time historically is also a project of healing the Jewish body, right?
Absolutely.
And creation of the so-called new Jew, the Jew that is no longer confined to these ideas of being weak exilic and quote unquote feminine,
Mm-hmm.
and will become a real strong man like all other strong men of different nations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So could you say something about that relationship between body and language? It comes a lot in the book, and maybe give us some examples from the
Mm-hmm.
different
Yeah,
texts.
yeah, that's a really important question. And I'm just asking myself now, what exactly is the relationship, between these two levels of the discussion, right? Are they parallel? Are they continuous in relation to one another? I'm not exactly sure, but I can definitely say that we need to think about the discourse of Hebrew revival as part of a national Zionist discourse that is essentially a masculinist discourse, because it is based on a fantasy, again, as we said, to become to become a new Jewish subject whose body, whose sexuality, whose power and language is transformed, is recovered, and the ideals that this is based on are obviously European and masculinist, national, romantic ideals. And one very important aspect in this discourse, which I don't think is that obvious, is that throughout this discourse, the language is gendered. And even though, Naomi Zayna has written about the sexual politics of Hebrew and Yiddish, how Yiddish is usually associated with the feminine, diasporic side, and Hebrew is with a more masculine side. And that is true. But in the debates themselves, as you said, the word language and all languages, including Hebrew, is a feminine noun in Hebrew. And this metaphor of language as woman is really, really prevalent. And throughout the discourse of Hebrew revival, there is this ongoing feminization of the language, against which the masculinity, I guess, of the writer, the Jewish man, the national subject, is measured. So it creates this really interesting dynamics in the relationship between the two. And one example is the one I already kind of briefly mentioned, which is Bialik and his relationship to Hebrew as a woman. That comes up in many different texts, but in the book I focus on a particular essay called Language Pangs that was written in 1907. And in this text, there's this one striking metaphor where Hebrew is described as a pregnant body that will not give birth. And so we, or I, the Hebrew poet, needs to assist the language in its labor, but somehow we are also the one who are fertilizing the language, and in a sense are birthing. But there's something really, really interesting that is going on, that I guess it becomes unclear who exactly is the reviver and who is being revived, right? Who is the object and who is the subject of revival? And that is something that is also true to revival as a whole. That in the midst of revival, or tchiyah, it's the reviver and the thing that is revived become it's very difficult to detach them.
Right.
So yeah, so I think that's one of the things that revival does. And it's unclear whether it is the language that gives life to us, or we that give life to the language. But there is a very important gender dimension here, that that also is, I guess, responsible to a lot of the violent rhetoric that we see in this discourse.
Right. And as you were speaking, I was just thinking that revival and tchiyah, the Hebrew word, do have a different emphasis, because tchiyah, basically what it really means is, what the image that you have is of a dead body, and the language then comes in, revives the dead body, literally brings them from death to life, and the author does the same for the language, right? So they're both,
it's not a perfect translation.
right? Their actual livelihood, life depends on getting oxygen from the other.
Right. There's something about Tchiyah that is really, that first of all kind of puts in doubt the liveliness of the object which is referred to. But also the phrase in itself is tied, it means something like revitalize, but also it's tied to the phrase Tchiyat HaMetim, which literally means the resurrection of the dead. So this is a really strong connotation, and I would say probably the dead part is more is alluded to more powerfully than in the translation revival.
Right.
But yeah, that's part of the ambiguity of the concept.
Right. I mean, it really, as you speak, and I didn't think about it before, but as you speak, it really brings me to Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle, because it really, the word tchia really captures with it this potential of pleasure principle, but that is always haunted by death drive.
Yes.
Right. So it's quite really quite fascinating. And with this, maybe it's a natural segue to talk about what is very clearly central in the book, which is that as much as this is a book about revival and a project of revival, it's primarily a book about failure.
Yes.
And it's primarily a book about the centrality of failure and focusing on what it means to fail.
Yeah, that's a very, very good way to put it. And I think this is what is this is what is so interesting in modern Hebrew literature, the ways in which it fails, at least in this moment, and the attempt, the attempt to become nationalized, to become a national language, to become European, to become men, and how that keeps on, failing, and what are the losses that are entwined with that. And so this is really one of the, one of the objectives of the book is to show how revival is much more than this triumphant narrative, which begins with a dead language and ends with a living language that is flourishing in the nation state in Israel. This is how I opened the book with a quote from a web page of the Ministry of Education, talking about Hebrew as a language that was dead for 1,000 years and now it's flourishing in Israel. And I think when you go back to these texts, what you see is, first of all, a much more complicated story, but mostly, yes, a story of failure, right? And a lot of it has to do with the auto-orientalizing that, of the language and of the subjects, the speaking subjects of the language, how, it's a constant attempt to become European, an attempt that fails repeatedly. To become European with this Semitic language, right, with all of its baggage, and they are reading it through, the lens of 19th century philology. So that's one layer of the failure, I would say. And one really interesting way in which this is expressed is through this idea of stammer, which I discuss in the fourth chapter of the book, mostly through the work of Yosef Chaim Brenner, the Hebrew author Yosef Chaim Brenner, and he has this novel that basically consists of kids in a settlement in Palestine in the beginning of the 20th century, and how they all speak Hebrew, but really they don't have any language and they all stammer. But this idea of stammering is not only there, right? When I went and checked, I saw that this word, gimgum, megamgamim, this Hebrew word, we find it everywhere when spoken Hebrew is mentioned. And by the 1920s, spoken Hebrew is a thing, right? It's not, it's not super prevalent, but it exists, and there's at least an attempt to teach Hebrew in some schools, both in Europe and in Palestine. But every time spoken Hebrew is mentioned, almost every time by everyone, different people who felt different about this, it is referred to as stammer. So I think that's another really, really interesting expression of the failure, right? How this attempt to create the language as a spoken language results in this stammer that pretty much all of the major writers at the time, they denigrate and they treat it as a terrible, terrible thing. And there's also a lot of anxiety about that. Like, oh, look what happened. We took Hebrew, which was this, precious treasure of the Jewish nation, and now by reviving it, we're turning it into this empty vessel, and all we have is this stammer. But I would also say that for people like Brenner, this is also really, really interesting poetically. So we have these two, in the novel, we have these two voices. On the one hand, we have a narrator who denigrates these young kids for stammering horribly in Hebrew. But then on the other hand, we have a narrator, a modernist narrator who's stammering himself.
Right. That's so interesting. And let's maybe, I think maybe the epilogue, which is about Gershom Scholem and this idea of the apocalypse and the promise of language revival. I think that kind of goes right into something that is profound, because we're not just talking about a language that, was maybe not spoken much, and then the idea of popularizing. We're talking about also a language that the process is to modernize it, and that primarily means to secularize it, to add secular vocabulary, modern day vocabulary, but at the same time, and precisely because they come from the influence of philology, the treasureness of Hebrew is in its sacred biblical forms, right? I mean, it's Hebrew in this project is like Sanskrit to Hindi, right? So it's a very sort of fine balance that probably does indeed produce anxiety, because how do you balance between the project of modernizing, which is associated, and we can talk about it if you wish to, with this idea of Europeanizing, right? And it's caught up with this idea of a certain image of secularism, which we know is not really secularism, it's really Christianity, but is known as secularism. But at the same time, without losing the power, it's not just, not losing some kind of a source of origins of this new old story, right? New old story, like Herzl's New Old Land. If you lose the old, you lose your cards, right? You lose whatever philologists are finding in it. That is the treasure, right? So there's a fine balance there. Anything, take it wherever you want.
Yeah, no, that's a really good observation, and I think it's more than just the old, right? I think, and this goes really to the point about the losses of revival, and why revival ends up either a discourse of mourning, or maybe we can even say melancholy, and it is a melancholic discourse. Yeah, this is one of the things that is so interesting, that when you go to the tropes of revival, even though this is supposed to be this triumphant narrative, it's all about the living dead, and buried bodies and wounded bodies, and it's a very it's kind of strewn with pain and morbid metaphors. And I do think it's a discourse of loss, and I think there are a lot of things that are lost. And one of the things is maybe the more religious aspect that Sholem is talking about, but really this sentiment that Sholem records in the 1920s is something that I find in these earlier texts, like late 19th century, early 20th century texts in Hebrew, and I think that Sholem really absorbs this. Unknowingly, because he claims in this famous letter to Franz Rosenzweig that I discuss in the epilogue, that no one is talking about that. Like, everyone is talking about the danger of the Arab population, the Palestinian Arab presence in Palestine, but no one is talking about the danger of language. And really, that's not the case. Everyone are talking about the danger of language, and everyone are talking this anxious discourse. Both the participants of revival and those who object it are very, very anxious about this project. And I think there are many, many reasons, but one is, as you said, the old part, or some of the baggages of the language might be lost, but also the standing of Hebrew in a multilingual context, right? The relationship of Hebrew to Yiddish, to other languages. The fact that it was never used before, before the state of Israel, it was never kind of used as this monolingual language. It was always surrounded and fed by other languages, and turning it into a language that is tied to a territory, tied to a nation state, that is in the service of all of these things. It kills something fundamental about what was actually vivacious about this language. So the multilingualism, the relationship to other languages, the religious aspect, the very rich modernist aspect of being a language that is not exactly spoken yet. So there are a lot of things that are I think are experienced as a loss of sorts. So there's mourning and there's failure, and I think that these are very important aspects of the discourse of revival.
Right. I'd like to ask you, for listeners who, or viewers, I forgot we're not on radio, but who know a little bit more of the context. If you don't mind saying, give us a little bit more examples, because I would like, and if you want, even read a tiny bit. I mean, because you're talking about, I myself am feeling slightly melancholic that writers like Hadam, Katzenelson, Brenner even, I don't believe are widely read at this point at all. I mean, the community of readers is very, very small. So the question now is, is this entire literature of revival, does it have a chance of being revived? Because they're so. If you could, maybe speak a little bit about the authors themselves, any aspect of it to just revive them a little bit.
I would just say that it's not my business to revive. Like I'm not engaging in actual revival of everything, and it's not the point of the project, to make these writers great again or anything like that. Like that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm happy to talk about these writers, and I also have my own attachment, to Hebrew literature. Ahad Am is an incredibly important and really, really interesting essayist. One of the reasons I went back to these texts is because I felt, there's still, these are really canonical texts. It's true that they are not widely read, which is like another question of why the canon of modern Hebrew is something that only scholars read. But these are really, really important writers. But there's something about these texts that I felt does merit a second reading and a different kind of reading. We mentioned Chaim Nachman Bialik, who is maybe of this bunch is the most read poet. Yosef Chaim Brenner, who was a very important author, critic, essayist, and then Rachel Katzenelson, who is the only woman who I address in the book. She was one of very few women Hebrew literary critics. But I guess I also wanted to say something about, so I'm not engaged in reviving, but there is something about revival that is interesting to me, poetically, politically maybe, and that is something that I do address toward the end of the book in the epilogue and with my reading of Sholem, that maybe there is a reclaiming that can be done with this idea of revival, this idea that maybe the language, even after being, tied to a nationalist project, maybe the language could be somehow, I don't want to use the word free because it's too dramatic, but this idea that maybe the words can be spoken differently, that maybe the language could speak differently because of this idea of revival, because of this understanding that there is something essentially uncontrollable in the language, because it could always become different from itself. Unlike what the popular narrative of revival would claim, that's it, the language is revived, and which really means it's dead, right? The language is revived and it's now the language of a nation, and therefore it's dead. So to think about language as non-dead, or is to think that maybe it could still become different. Maybe there's something about the language that could help us, escape this terrible reality and recreate.
Right, I very much hope so. We're reaching the end of the interview, but I did want to ask you, I mean, on the one hand, in the case of Hebrew and the project of revival, one could say, and it's often said, oh, wow, this is a historical case that doesn't match anything. You had a language that was an antique language that nobody spoke, and now you have a nation with a language that is the official language of the nation, etc. But on the other hand, are there any attempts to ever really break apart in modern times language and nationalism? Obviously, before 19th century, hasn't been the case, right? But isn't the project of modern nationalism, in essence, not just this case, always built on this fantasy that there is a language that is somehow tied and also owned
Mm-hmm.
by, so in the cases of colonial spread of language, it still remains that, the source of the language becomes from mother colony,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
So, I mean, would you say that perhaps your project that questions that success moment,
Mm-hmm.
that's something that you could also say about other contexts, that maybe say in the case of that for French, for example, to be alive, it will have to stop being French.
Yes, yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I do address in the book is that revival is always a project that attempts to present itself as unique, right? As this one of a kind, and to this day, this is really how the revival of Hebrew is addressed. And of course, there are some nuances. There are some things about the linguistic transformation of Hebrew which I guess are unique. But there is something about the language of uniqueness that is obviously also the language of nationalism
Right.
and the
Right.
national language paradigm. But I didn't think about it this way, right? So I thought about revival as being something that happens in many other languages,
Right.
but thinking that for languages really to be alive, what they need, is this otherness, this kind of
Yes.
being much more loosely defined and understanding that the borders are completely fluid and so I like that idea a lot. And I opened the book with a quote from Toni Morrison's Nobel
Yes.
Prize lecture, and I think it's exactly about that, right? I don't remember it by heart, but I think it's something about the paralysis of a language that we might think of as living, but yeah, we can definitely read
It's
that. And
Toni
read that.
Morrison. We
Yes.
have to
Yeah.
give.
So for her, a dead language is not only one no longer spoken or written, it is unyielding language, content to admire its own paralysis. And this is really a point of departure for me because, you know, again, I want to understand anew what these concepts of a dead and living language and revival mean. And I think, yeah, definitely there's something dead about a language that is admiring its own paralysis, that is fixed, that is
Yes.
stable, that sees itself as tied to a nationalist project and that
Yes.
works in the service of nationalist ideology. And there is something appealing in the idea that the language can become different from itself.
Yes. That's very, very beautiful. Let's hope that language can become different from itself. And thank you so much, Roni. And I'll just show the book. It's published by Penn, University of Penn Press. And it's also a beautiful cover. I don't know.
Yeah. The painting is by Jacques Lezra.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Jacques Lezra, beautiful cover.
Yeah.
Beautiful book. Get it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roni.